Greetings and welcome. I am Justavor, bringing you what I hope is constructive information on what the system of white supremacy, racism, is and how it works, as well as what can be done to replace it with the system of justice. How do education systems support white supremacy? Miseducation of the VORs. In this video, we explore how modern education systems are used to teach non-white children to be victims while at the same time teaching white children to maintain, expand, and refine the system of white supremacy, racism. The ancestor, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, founder of Negro History Week, which evolved into the current Black History Month, illustrated in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, that when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. Do white people actually control non-white people's thinking? Is such a thing even possible? Or is Justavor just making up excuses to justify blaming white people for everything? On that last question, according to the code, those most responsible in situations of power are those with the most power. In the global system of white supremacy, racism, the people who classify themselves as white are the power group. They are the captains of the ship. They are the wardens and prison guards of the global prison, which is a sort of open-air panopticon or global ghetto. Is it possible to control the minds of other people? Studies in psychoanalytic theory have long proven the ability to influence, condition, and control the minds and behaviors of people and animals. Whether we are talking about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, the Skinner box experiment, the Stanford prison study, the Asch conformity experiment, the Little Albert experiment, and many others, including the work of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and her theory of color confrontation. Evidence demonstrates that people can be influenced, conditioned, and or controlled consciously and or subconsciously. So, how do white people control the minds and behaviors of their non-white victims? As the ancestor Carter G. Woodson wrote about long ago, the primary tool of brain trashing victims of white supremacy has been through the education system non-white people have been forced into. On the social level, white identification has been a weapon used to control the access to resources and information that white people allow non-white people to have. A notable example in the United States concept would be the so-called 5 civilized tribes. But white identification is often weaponized on the individual level. Both dynamics, formal education through education systems and informal education through social norms and white identification levels, have been used to control how non-white people think, speak, and behave, especially in matters directly related to the subject of racism, as well as in all major areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war/counter-war. So, what is the purpose of education? According to the code, as per Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., the purpose of education is to learn how to solve problems. Are the education systems teaching us and our offspring to solve problems, or is it teaching us how to be victims while simultaneously teaching white children to be people in power, to be white supremacists? Why are non-white people so able to assist in solving white people's problems, but seem to be absolutely ineffective in solving the biggest problem non-white people face, the problem of the system of white supremacy? It appears that the system is designed to be this way. Some may ask, but don't non-white people also benefit from the system of white supremacy? And don't some white people also suffer? Some white people are allowed to be harmed in the system so that it becomes difficult to tell that the system of racism exists. This causes great confusion among victims of racism. However, no matter how many white people are allowed to be harmed, the dynamic of white power over powerless non-white continues. This strategy is referred to in the code book as racial white sacrifice confusion. Some white people are allowed to suffer in the system of white supremacy, but they are not the targets of the system. Non-white people are. These white sacrifices are what white people may refer to as collateral damage. Some non-white people are allowed to receive resources, wealth, and better treatment than most other victims. This strategy is referred to in the code as racial showcasing confusion. and it renders victims of racism who are targeted for this strategy utterly useless when it comes to helping other victims replace white supremacy with justice. By no means are these showcased victims safe from racists. One can find a plethora of examples where wealthy and or famous non-white people are being mistreated by those who practice racism. I encourage you to research these incidents carefully. Usually, those victims selected for racial showcase and confusion are those who demonstrate high levels of white identification. What is white identification? According to the late, great Pamela Evans Harris, in her book, The Interracial Con Game, written under the pseudonym Umoja, describes a white identified black person as a person who views the world through a white perspective, even when it conflicts with his or her own self and group interests. A white identified black pursues interests, activities, and relationships primarily because white people are associated with them, and often avoids or looks down on certain people, places, and things primarily because black people are associated with them. The ancestor, Pam the Great, notes that how a black person sees black people, talks to black people, treats black people, feels about being a black person, and treats white people determines the degree of white identification. This term can also be applied to other non-white people who are not classified as black. Taking into account the aspects of white culture that have been forced upon non-white people, language, religion, holidays, social norms, political ideologies, etc., that tend to be a benefit to white people at the expense of non-white people, Justavor concludes that all non-white people have been infected with some degree of white identification. This should be kept in mind when in contact with more confused victims of racism who are demonstrating their confusion and victimization through their mistreatment of themselves and or other victims of racism. The code suggests no contact, no conflict. While compassion and patience with other VORs can be constructive ways to minimize conflict in situations where contact cannot be avoided. But how does this miseducation by white people keep non-white people from solving the problem of racism? Compulsory education laws force non-white people to send their offspring to these white-controlled mental concentration camps to be miseducated. The curriculum as well as qualifications for becoming teachers are controlled by state and federal education boards, which are dominated by suspected racists. Take a look at the school boards. Take a look at who is doing the teaching. Over 80% of teachers are white, with over 70% being white females. You know, the first teacher of every white supremacist, of every white terrorist. While even in schools where the majority of students are classified as black, only 36% of teachers are black. Even so, teachers do not typically choose the curriculum. The state boards of education approve curriculums as well as teaching licenses and guidelines for choosing school faculty. Those boards are subject to the state's voting majority, which, in every single U.S. state, are white citizens. We have seen how this plays out when we take a codified look at critical race theory being proposed and introduced as part of state curriculums. I should note that in places where non-white people are the numerical majority, white people can still be found influencing and manipulating those victims in some way that ultimately benefits the white supremacists. What about the students? According to blackdemographics.com, roughly 70% of 8 million plus black students in the United States concept attend public school. This includes the 488,000 plus that attend charter schools, while roughly 430,000 attend private schools. 75% of these private school students attend religious schools. It is one thing that social norms are dominated by white culture, and the conclusion here is that white supremacy is white culture, and that laws favor maintaining, expanding, and or refining the system of white supremacy to influence non-white people outside of the formal education setting. But laws compelling attempted parents to submit their offspring to this type of formal education or miseducation are to influence and control non-white people inside the formal education setting, and should be considered a criminal act. It is interesting that people can understand this concept when it comes to Nazis educating Jewish children or Russians educating Ukrainian children, but not when it is suspected racists educating young victims of racism, white supremacy. According to compulsory education laws, those attempted parents who do not comply with said laws are the ones who will face accusations of criminality, sometimes resulting in greater confinement, sometimes resulting in their offspring being taken away and possibly sold or even given to someone, likely white people, who are more likely to comply with said laws. What is the ultimate effect that this miseducation has on non-white children? The ultimate effect is the maintenance of the system of white supremacy for the next generation or longer. While white children are taught to be future leaders, non-white children are conditioned to be their servants. The education, or miseducation, system is designed for white students to develop the skills needed to compete for jobs and resources at the highest levels, while non-white students are sabotaged and left unprepared for adult life, unable to compete. These effects within the context of expectations are referred to as the Pygmalion and Golem effects. Studies show that black students fall behind in every major area of study, including reading, history, geography, civics, and mathematics. About 63.3% of black students graduate. That's just above half, while the rate for the so-called United States is 80.6%. The dropout rate for black students in 2010 was 8%. For white students, it was 5.1%. Nearly twice as many black students as white students dropped out of high school. A major factor that contributes to this sabotage of non-white students has to do with the low expectations being placed upon them. Studies show that expectations have a profound impact on how people develop and how well they can solve problems and achieve their goals. According to a study by Rubovitz and Mayer, teachers' expectations placed on black students and white students had a major impact on a student's ability to achieve, especially when a teacher's dogmatism, based on the Rokich dogmatism scale, Form E, is demonstrated. They don't outright say racism or white supremacy, which I suspect could be an act of racism in itself, but this dogma that factored in the teacher's expectations of their students resulted in more praise for white students and outright ignoring black students. Even when black students were labeled as gifted, they were mistreated and ignored in favor of white students labeled as non-gifted. This type of effect is nothing new to black people, but I think these studies do demonstrate that those who classify themselves as white study their interactions with non-white people all the time, as well as the effects those interactions have. The conclusion here is that white people are not ignorant about racism. If anyone is ignorant about racism, it is the victims of racism, white supremacy, non-white people. So, how do we counter the effects that the system of white supremacy, racism, has on non-white people, especially children, in Area 2, education? According to the code book, Mr. Fuller suggests that it is correct for all victims of white supremacy, non-white people, to know and understand all that the white supremacists teach, as well as why they teach what they teach. It is correct for all victims of white supremacy to know and understand all that the white supremacists know and understand. VORs should do your best to make available to young people all the most constructive information that you have acquired and that you seek to acquire. Take special care to teach only that will produce the most constructive results. This is a little bit of Justavor VGQ here, but I think of the ancestor, Malcolm Omowale Shabazz, famously remembered as Malcolm X, when he spoke of the dangers associated with one's enemies teaching their offspring. I suggest homeschooling if you can. I am aware that victims of racism are often ill-equipped to give our offspring formal education, and that many VORs are single-attempted parents who have to juggle financial obligations. This makes homeschooling a difficult and nearly impossible option for many. I speak from experience when I say that it is possible. Justavor is an attempted parent to multiple offspring in my care unit who have been homeschooled their entire lives. I too know the difficulties of balancing the obligations to pay the bills with my obligations to ensure that my offspring are less confused and less mistreated in the system of white supremacy, racism. For those who have no option but to send their offspring to institutions where they are more likely to be confused and mistreated by those who practice racism, directly or indirectly, I would suggest being as informed and aware as possible of what is being taught and what is happening to your offspring as a result of their being miseducated in these institutions. Develop a code to counter as much miseducation as possible when your offspring is in your presence. What are your thoughts on how the system of white supremacy affects Area 2 education, especially when it comes to young VORs? Feel free to leave your questions, comments, and concerns. For more information about the purpose and goals of this channel, as well as some basic definitions of words and terms we use in reference to our work, I have included a link below to a video containing this information. If you would like an even better understanding of the code and how it works, please visit producejustice.com to order the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept by Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. There are many constructive suggestions for ending the system of white supremacy, and Mr. Fuller's codebook and its word guide act as guides to getting and keeping on code. If you feel this content is constructive and worth your time and energy, please subscribe and share to support the making of more content in the future. Much appreciation for all the VORs already subscribed. I am Justavor, and I am still learning. Thank you for watching. Until next time.
Let me say something that gets to the very crux of the matter, and this may be offensive for some to hear who are not on the side that we're on. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.
Say that again.
Let me say it one more time for those of you who didn't hear me. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.